Greg Clark from the Centre for Public Christianity. Well, if you take science seriously, as most of us do, is there room for believing in God? And with me today is someone who gives a resounding yes to that question, John Lennox, the Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford, and the author of the book God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? John, welcome to Sydney.
Thank you very much.
Let's dive right in at the deep end. Do you feel like a lonely figure as both a scientist and a theist?
Not really. I think the two belong together, and I'm far from lonely. Take someone, for example, like Francis Collins, who's the director of the Human Genome Project. He is a Christian, and Bill Phillips, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1998, is also a Christian. So I don't feel a lonely figure at all.
Well, you also feel that Christianity played something of a role in the rise of science. Can you explain to us what you mean by that?
Historically, science exploded in the 16th and 17th centuries in Western Europe. And people have asked the question, why then and why there? And it was Sir Alfred North Whitehead, I suppose, at the beginning, who argued strongly for the fact that science arose because people believed not simply that nature was ordered, but they believed that there was a rational mind of God behind nature, and therefore nature could be understood by rational minds. And so with that kind of Christian foundation, science could grow. Whereas in China, which had a lot of technological development, science didn't grow in that way. And Joseph Needham, who was a brilliant Oxford sinologist, he searched, because he was a Marxist, a long time for some kind of materialistic explanation, but in the end he came up with a view that science did not develop in China like it did in the West precisely because they did not have that unifying concept of a creator.
What sort of things is science good at, and where does it strike its limits?
Science is very good at asking the how questions and the why questions, if you like, where it's why a function. But it doesn't really deal with the questions of intention or purpose. I mean, you can see that very easily by, for example, imagining here's a lady who's baked a cake and you're the Nobel Prize winner and whatever, and I ask you to analyze the cake and you reduce it to elementary particles and all the rest of it. You give me a brilliant description of it. But then I say to you, why did she make the cake? You'll immediately find your science is at an end. You will not be able to determine, even if you brain scan her, why she made the cake unless she reveals it to you. So science cannot, as Sir Peter Medawar, I suppose he formulated best, Nobel Prize winner, he said science, you see its limits very easily in that it cannot address the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? What am I here for? What's the meaning of my life?
One of those questions that gets asked in an area of great controversy, I think, between believers in God and others, is the origins of the universe. I mean, can anyone really come to a conclusion as a scientist that there is a God behind it all?
Well, I think it's possible to come to a conclusion as a scientist that there's a God behind it all. The standard model, the standard Big Bang model, is essentially a label on a mystery, but at least it says there was a beginning. There was a beginning. And that's a very interesting thing, because speaking now as a Christian, it interests me, it fascinates me in fact, that the Bible has for millennia been saying that there was a beginning. It took science up until about the 1960s to admit the same thing, because they'd been so influenced by Aristotle's notion of an eternal universe. So the idea of there being a beginning raises very big questions. What is the cause behind? So I see absolutely no incompatibility here in postulating God as the first cause. I mean, I have much stronger reasons than that for believing God is behind it as a scientist, but that's a start.
One of your specialist areas of study is information theory. And
well, I'm very interested in it as a mathematician.
Yes. How does it relate at all to your belief in God?
Well, yes, it does. Because one of the fascinating things, I think, about science in the last 50 years or so is the discovery that the DNA is the base of the structure of proteins and the base of life, so to speak. And that involves words, indeed one very long word, 3.5 billion letters long. And it's a word with significance in a four-letter alphabet, the codons. It's a word that's significant. It has a meaning. It has a semiotic dimension because the DNA word codes for the proteins. Now, when you see words that have meaning, they tend to come from an intelligence. And I think, wearing my mathematical hat, that you don't get any free lunch anywhere here. That the very fact we have this word is an indicator that there's an intelligence behind it. I mean, it amuses me, really. If you saw a letter, a single letter of the alphabet, say an A, traced on a beach in Sydney, for example, one of these wonderful beaches you have, you'd immediately argue that an intelligence had put it there. And yet I discover that people can look at 3.5 billion letters in exactly the right order, and then they say, chance and necessity, account for it exhaustively. That puzzles me greatly. Now, I know there's a lot more to it than that.
Yes. Is it like the question of the monkeys put together and eventually typing Shakespeare? Is that the sort of...
Well, in a way it is, but nobody, not even the strongest atheists I meet, believe in chance origins of life. That's gone out a long time ago. Richard Dawkins would want to argue that it's chance and necessity, chance plus the laws of nature, because the probabilities of getting life simply by random mixing of molecules and so on are just way off the scale. They are far too low. But Dawkins will argue that there is a law-like effect of natural selection that increases the probabilities. Now, I would want to argue that when you analyze those simulations that Dawkins does, what he does very effectively is smuggle intelligence in by the back door.
Fascinating. You spent a lot of time debating and discussing these issues with Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and other atheists.
Well, I've had a couple of major debates, that's right.
Indeed, yes, and people can find those on the web.
Yes, that's
there's
right.
a lot of discussion about those debates. How significant is the understanding of science in those debates? Is it the core?
It's very significant. Well, let's put it this way. What we're talking about now is what calls itself the new atheism. And at the core of the new atheism, there are a number of scientists, some of them very high-powered, like Steven Weinberg, who think that the best thing science can do, and I'm quoting him at a recent conference in America, the best thing science can do could eliminate religion. And the basic logic is very simple. They regard all religion as dangerous, so it's got to be eliminated. How are we going to eliminate it? We use the cultural authority of science. So science lies at the heart of it because of its cultural power.
In these debates that you have with people and the debates you're lined up to have here in Sydney, what do you hope people will go away with who are listening to the debate at the end? What's your big hope?
I hope to stimulate them to think that there are rational alternatives to atheism, that atheism is not what it at first sight appears to be. That is the only intellectually respectable position for a scientifically trained person to occupy.
John Lennox, thank you very much.
Not at all. Pleasure.